the last speaker of this morning session. It's Luigi Baciadonna. He's currently located at the University of Turin, working in the Department of Life Science and Systems Biology. Right recently, he started to conduct cognitive research on penguins, but is still involved in ongoing corvid research from his former postdoc at Queen Mary University London. But the work he's presenting today has been part of his PhD thesis, where he focused on the assessment of emotions in farm animal species, and here specifically on the humble goat. Luigi, the screen is yours.
Okay. Can anyone hear me properly? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Share the screen. Yeah, you should see probably now the screen, yeah?
Not yet, no.
No? Why not? Desktop one. Share the screen.
Now it's working. We see your desktop background.
Yes, we managed, I think, to do that. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yes. Okay, so thank you very much for this fantastic opportunity for me to present my research. And I think my presentation, at least for the first 2 or 3 slides, will be overlapping with what Paolo Baragli was presenting to you before. And then I'm focusing on an aspect that, to me, when I was doing my PhD, was, I think, in some sense, under the text in the animal welfare field, because we had like an overlapping between promising a way to assess the emotion using the judgment bias, and at the same time, another group in Netherlands, they pushed this kind of anticipatory behavior as a tools for assessing the goats, assessing the emotion in general. And I think because just the time overlapping between these 2 main paradigm, of course, we know the story. We have like over 250 papers on judgment bias, a few of them on the anticipatory behavior in animal farm, or even in cognition in general. This is my last chunk of my PhD, and then I moved my research on the corvids cognition, and now I'm actually working on penguins, and back to the origin when I was interested in exploring the bioacoustics of animals. So the outline of the talk. Yeah, so I think one aspect that Paolo was saying before, I mean, it's important in order to assess what we call a psychological phenomenon like emotion, we have to use a multi-components methods. In our case, I was doing that system in order to decode from non-human animal emotion. And in doing that, I'm proposing, or I'm presenting the data on reward-related behavior. So how essentially the goats or the animals in general evaluate a specific situation that we think are related to some kind of emotionally inducing situation, and how this can fit in terms of using or employ that technique in order to detect what kind of welfare the animals experience at that moment. The take-home message I like to do at the beginning, so if anyone get bored, you can go for a coffee, but generally what I want to convey today is that goats show different behavioral and physiological responses to positive compared to negative and neutral control events, suggesting that the anticipatory response paradigm may be used as a valid tools to capture the affected states of an individual. And I'm going to express or to describe that sentence during my talk, and at the end I will call again that type of message. Why we are interested in animal welfare? I mean, this slide is just an example of the goats livestock in the world, and the country that at the moment are the most, they're producing animals, essentially goats. As you see, I mean, there's like a sort of amount of goats in Asia, but also in Africa, and in North or in South America. Also, there is this slide that's showing how the number of goats population in the world is increasing from 2015 until 2019, which at the moment we have almost 1 billion of goats around the world. So therefore, I mean, we know that livestock play a crucial role in global system because they are the main source of animal proteins, crop productivity, but also they bring with them a lot of issues. For example, the greenhouse emission, the impact on biodiversity and ecosystem system as well, like for example, how we use the lands available in order to keep the animals around us. Also, I mean, as we know, especially this year, the impact of the livestock and especially the massive production, as we see in probably in Asia or in other parts of the world, can in some sense put at risk the health of humans for the zoonotic disease that they can actually transmit to humans. Therefore, I mean, I think we are responsible for their welfare, and we have an increasing pressure from the society in order for us to be able to do that. The challenge, I think, is meant to, the first one, as Paolo was saying before, is to have a clear definition of what we actually mean for emotion. And this is a challenge because essentially the emotion is a psychological phenomenon, and we have to, we don't have like the means to ask directly to the animals how they feel. Therefore, we have to use some kind of proxy behavioral or cognitive or psychological aspect in order for us to detect that core effect of the animals. Also, I mean, we have to work in the definition, when we work out definition of the emotion, therefore we can, in some sense, work on how we can improve the animal welfare or the quality of the life that the animal we are currently keeping with us. One way to, I think, I mean, as Paolo was saying before, I mean, we have like probably more than one definition of the emotion, but what we can extrapolate for all this literature at the moment is a multi-component phenomenon. This means that we can operationalize the definition of the emotion, and therefore we can study the emotion. So the one aspect of the emotion is the subjective experience, and at the moment we cannot really access to that unless they can speak with humans. Also, we have this neurophysiological activation, and one example is the physiological, like the cardiac activation, but also the respiration rates, and it's quite simple to understand this because I mean, essentially, when we are experiencing really intense emotion, potentially how our heart rates or respiration rates increase because triggered by that specific event. Also the behavior, this can be from analyzing essentially the behavior, but also the vocalization is within the behavior component. And also the cognitive evaluation, which is my focus during my PhD. And I was doing a bit of judgment bias, but also other aspects, for example, the anticipatory behavior in goats. Essentially, what we can do to keep even more simple than the definition before, we can describe the emotion along two main axes. One will be the positive or negative axis, which would be pleasant and unpleasant the situations are, and also the intensity of the emotion in terms of high intense or high aroused or low aroused situation. And we can, in some sense, along these two axes, detect the core effect, which is the space within this two-dimensional picture you see on the screen. As I said before, I mean, the other important aspect is how we define the emotion, the welfare, and because this is actually quite linked to the definition of emotion as well. And I like the definition that Van der Haast and Spoo did in 2007, where essentially they were proposing that there's an integration of positive and negative experience that establish the states of an animal in terms of welfare. Obviously, this means that when we have too many negative experience, like chronic failure to cope, then the balance will be shifted towards the negative aspects of the negative side of the balance. And this means that essentially the reward sensitivity is the adjustment that someone is putting in place in order to establish the equilibrium between the negative and the positive experience. And I like also the analogy they do in terms of the bank account. So imagine we are at the moment managing our bank account, and we have like a sort of flow of money coming in and coming out. But when too many bills is coming in, so basically someone call us and they say, Paul, you have to work in order to make your balance right. And in the same sense, I mean, for us, it would be our brain seeing that something is going wrong. Therefore, we should, in some sense, seeking for a reward in order for us to reestablish the equilibrium between the negative and the positive aspect of our life. The definition, as I said before, I mean, that definition is helping us because we can use the reward-related behavior as a tool to assess and improve the welfare. Why? The reason is essentially because the negative experience induce an increased sensitivity to positive experience, and therefore we can assess the welfare of the animals because the sensitivity at that moment is reflecting the past experience of an animal. The second aspect will be the negative experience can be compensated by positive experience, and that means we can, in some sense, providing a regular presentation of positive experience that's, in some sense, compensate the negative or a chronic failure for an animal to cope on that event. Also, I mean, this is the parts I'm talking today, that we can use the reward-related behavior as a tool to assess the animal's perception of an event. And this can be done by capitalizing on the natural behavior of animals that is showing when is expecting something to come in the near future. So therefore, I mean, based on their reaction of forthcoming events, they will react differently according to the valence or the intensity of a specific emotion. So basically, one way to assess the reward sensitivity is to evoke what we call an anticipatory behavior, which is the behavior response that an animal is putting in place when is expecting a forthcoming reward. And one way to do this is a classical conditioning paradigm, was designed, I mean, from Pavlov, and it's essentially, it's quite simple. We need to associate an event, for example, a light or a sound, with a reward. And then when the connection or when the association between these two events is established, then we can extend the time interval, or how they call this, the trace interval between the sound, the lights, and the reward, and assess what happened in this 2-point time, and then recording the behavior, or basically recording what we call the multi-components aspect of the emotions. So to do this, I mean, what we did was to use the goats at Buttercups, which is a sanctuary for goats based in UK, in Maidstone. Obviously, because we are working with animals that's been rescued from difficult situation, we cannot really provoke intense emotion. Therefore, I mean, the type of stimuli we can use, they need to be adjusted or tailored by the sample size we were using at that time. We had access to a lot of animals. For this study, I used 30 animals, and I split in 10 goats for each group. The first group was positive. So what we think was positive, essentially, we were providing at the end of this association a food which was quite palatable for them. It's a mixture between apple and carrots. The negative is the same, similar situation to the positive, but in that case, the animals won't have access to the food, even though they can smell, and can touch with the tongue, like the food. And also the neutral one, which is just basically controlling that the sound itself can affect the behavior of the animals. And therefore, we're just presenting the sound, keeping all the other variables, so the confounding factor, similar to the positive and negative group. When we establish this three situation, then we plan out the associative learning. And in our case, was done during 11 days, so consecutive 11 sessions. And we were repeating the session twice after a bit of interval in order to strengthen the association between a sound, in our case, a clicker sound, and the rewards that can be positive or negative in our case. And then, I mean, from the baseline, so it's essentially the time 0, where there's no association yet established in the goals in this case, we decide to keep the same time that we were planning to reach at the end of the anticipatory behavior paradigm. And this will be a sort of control within the same group, but also between the groups. And then from session 1, session 2, we were increasing the seconds that is passing between the sound and the access to the rewards. And we were interested in measuring 3 time points, which is baseline, the trial number 6, which is the middle point, was the interval was almost 2.5 minutes, and then at the end, when was the maximum extension of the delay, which was 5 minutes. Yes, so these are the crucial time points we were interested in exploring, and this was used for the statistics as well. According to the definition of the emotion we gave before, we were recording 3 main aspects. So the first one was the physiology, the heart rate, and on the heart rate, we calculate the heart rate variability. And then we scored, I think, more than 8 or 9 behaviors, the time activity, which is what in literature, we have a bit of literature on that regards, the rapid head movements, the calls produced during the experiments, also the ear position and the tail position, which I'm not going to discuss today. And also we we analyzed all the calls produced by the animals, the duration, but also the time and the frequency of the calls. And again, this aspect is not discussed today because, I mean, we have like limited time to talk about this. For what concerns the physiology, I mean, I hope you can see well the slides, but essentially we have what we were expecting in some sense. So the positive condition induce a higher heart rate compared to the control of the negative condition. Whereas we don't have any evidence that the heart rate variability were different even within or between the conditions. And I think this mainly is the type of design we use. And essentially, we thought that the positive and the negative control are quite similar in terms of balance, and therefore we wouldn't expect any difference in the heart rate variability. For what concerns the behavior, so the first one, which was the focal point, is to assess how the activity, which was defined as the movements of the goats within the time allocating between the sound and the rewards. We have essentially the goats were more active during the end. So basically when the association between the sound and the reward was stronger compared to the baseline and to the middle phase. Also, I mean, we have an effect of the condition. In that case, we know that the positive condition, they moved more compared to the negative again, but also to the control group. Although we don't have any difference between the control and the negative group. For what concerns the other behavior, I mean, the head movements, I mean, the rapid head movements has been linked with also with intensity of the emotion, especially in goats. There is this paper published by Elodie briefer in 2015, where we were mapping the emotion of the goats. It was one of the key parameters for us to assess the intensity of the emotion of the goats. In our case, we have similar type of results. Essentially, the goats moves or the heads rapidly in the negative and positive condition from the baseline to the middle phase, but also to the ends for the positive condition. And this is, I mean, we have an interaction effect there between the condition and phase. So it's a bit overcrowded, I think, the picture, but essentially what you see in the positive, you have an increase movements of the heads from the baseline towards the middle at the end phase, which was different from the negative. But again, between the negative and the control, we don't have any kind of effects or difference between the conditions. Also, we were splitting the data in two. So the first part was just to see how the frequency or the occurrences of the calls were different across the condition. And again, I mean, as you see, it's quite remarkable. So all the goats called essentially in the positive condition compared to the negative and the control. However, I mean, we didn't find any differences in the structure of the call in any domain, so in the time or the frequency domain. And I think we were quite shocked to these results because Elodie Briefer did a lot of work on the bioacoustics on the calls of the goats, exploring how they will change according to the situation. But I think in our case, I mean, the sample size were quite limited, but also we have an issue in terms of different body size of the goats and a huge variation or variation range of goats that were never calling or calling too much during our experiments. So just to summarize, so what we can say is essentially, just to give an overview, is the positive condition induced general increase of activity in terms of rapid head movements, but also in terms of walking in order before receiving the reward of the event, which was positive, negative, or control. And also we have an increase of call rate for the positive condition. And this is in line with the literature on the anticipatory behavior. So what we normally expect is an increase of activity that in some cases has been assessed by counting the transitional behavior of a subject. So how often is changing the type of movements inside the arena. Also, the positive condition was perceived differently than the negative and the neutral condition. However, the distinction between the negative and control was not detected using that paradigm. And I think we have speculated a little bit about these results. I mean, essentially what we came out was because we have two directions. In one case, the negative was not so negative, or similarly in terms of activation to the control, or the control situation is not actually so neutral for the goats. So essentially can be either way, and especially because we are not doing or we are not inducing really intense type of emotion to the goats. So the take-home message again, I mean, what we can say is the results suggested it is essential to assess whether the condition we design, and therefore we think that we are inducing some kind of emotion, are effectively induce that emotion, and whether the trigger emotions is based on the parameters we are using in order for us to establish the core effect of an individual. And also, I mean, we can say the validation, the paradigm I'm using, or I was using at the time, is quite good because it's helping us to mapping the different components of the emotion. And this can be used in a setting where we want to improve the quality of life of an individual based on the life history of an individual. And this, I think, at the end of my talk. And I don't put the thank you slides because I like to keep the summary slide there. But obviously, this work involved a lot of collaboration with Elodie Briefer, which is a co-author of this paper, but also the hospitality of the Buttercup Sanctuary for Goats that's host me, but also Christian Nawroth for 2 years, and other many students for their research. And yes, thank you.
Thanks, Luigi, for the great talk. Just to mention, your screen is still shared, so we can see your desktop.
A second, and I will.
So we're happy to take any questions then. Okay, I don't see any raised hands by now. Just starting with one of my own. I remember from the outcomes, particularly the behavioral outcomes, that the head movement was increased in the negative and in the positive condition, but not in the baseline. Would this indicate that this is a general response to an increased arousal, and it would be only arousal specific?
I mean, yes, essentially, anticipatory behavior is more, I think, for our results we got from the studies, essentially more the intensity, the arousal of emotion. Because I mean, we have like a sort of graduality of intensity from the negative control and the positive in all the parameters we got. So even for the movements of the animals, we have the same kind of trends. What I was expecting to see, because I mean, when Elodie published the paper on animal behavior about mapping the emotion of goats, we were having a lot of issue in justifying why essentially waiting too much for a reward can be itself quite negative as well. And I think it was quite both by people where reviewers were suggesting that, because essentially, yes, if you're waiting 2 minutes or 5 minutes will change your way to anticipate something. And I was hoping, and I did that design in order for me to see how within the same group will actually change as well the perception of the event. But I think I failed because I don't have any really strong evidence that in that case, the negative or the positive will become negative when they're waiting too much for a reward.
Okay, thanks, Luigi. I think Charlotte and Rebecca simultaneously raised their hands, so make that up between the two of us. Who's first?
I have to decide. I mean, no.
No.
So then maybe I can. Oh, you want to begin, Rebecca?
I think Charlotte, you can go first.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for this super interesting talk. I wanted to ask you if you check or if you plan to measure this reward sensitivity and to check for individual differences, or would you expect that you have individuals that are more sensitive to rewards and others that are less?
I mean, for sure. I mean, I would expect a massive difference within the individuals, even on the plots. I mean, you see the variation within the individuals. I mean, for the coal produced during the experiments, we had like an issue that's Heidi. I think Christian knows I'm talking about the goats in that case. So Heidi was calling constantly. I mean, for 5 minutes. So we had like almost 200 calls from one subject in the positive condition. So I'm assuming you see a huge of variation as well. I'm planning not to work anymore with goats. This is the main issue. In the last 5 years, I changed like basically 3 models. And the moment I'm working with the penguins, and I hope to stay with penguins for a bit longer in order for me to get a permanent position somewhere.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for last question, Rebecca.
I can't hear you, Rebecca.
Ah, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Permanent position in Antarctica. I've been so impressed with the research that has come out of buttercups. It seems like an amazing place. One of the questions that I guess you all face when doing the research with the rescues that are at buttercups, how much do you think that the previous experience and the variability that they'll have, how much do you think that influences the results that you get from what you're looking at now? I mean, do you think that do you think the results would be less variable if you had all of them from the same farm? Or I realize that this is a theoretical question that you can't answer, but do you think that causes a lot of variability?
This is like one of the things where I decide to move a bit out, because I think we are portraying buttercups as a place where you see goats that are not well treated before. I mean, we have like a massive variation of goats. So you have, I mean, it's a UK, it's not, I don't know, in Italy, we have a different type of style to keep the animals. But even in the neglect definition in UK probably won't fit the definition we have in Italy. So essentially what we have like a huge variation of how the previous or the past history of these animals. In my experience, we had like really probably 10 or 20 goats that were not really came from a bad situation, and we never managed to work with them, obviously. The sample size I was using, but I think this is also the case for Christian and Elodie, is you normally have access to 150 goats, and you try to work with the goats that are not really stressed about the human presence. Plus, most of my work was isolating an animals from the group within the same herd, I mean, within the same location, but I was putting this fence, or the green fence, around to avoid any contacts, but also other goats jumping in the arena when they're doing the experiments. So essentially, I think it's a bit of bias on the type of goats we are selecting for the experiments. We were trying to keep a balance based on the previous experience of the goats, but also another really constraint of that place is that they're all males basically, and they're castrated males. So from 150 goats, you have 120 that are males. They are not even males anymore, I mean, by definition, because they are castrated, and all imagine the impacts on the vocal structure of these animals. So it's not even a good representative of that. And so I was happy to work there, and there is a fantastic place. We did a lot of work, but also there are also some kind of aspect that people won't know unless you had experience working directly in that place.
Thanks, Luigi. Just, yeah, as a side note from my experience, and Faye mentioned this earlier as well, that it's a sanctuary. So it's not a lab and not a research facility. So you can expect a lot of noise from the environment as well. So this might be another pitfall for this as well. But it was really efficient having all these animals already being habituated to humans, which saves a lot of time and can help a lot with data collection. So thanks a lot for all this, or to all the speakers from this morning session. We've seen a lot of great presentations. We are now going to lunch break for 1.5 hours. And before we finally, or